Christ is among us.
Light Through the Past, a survey of church history. Dr. Cyril Gary Jenkins is the president of the St. John Chrysostom Academy, the director of the Center for Orthodox Thought and Culture, the editor of the Basilian Journal, and a member of St. Paul Orthodox Church in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.
Boldly proclaiming the truth of the risen Christ. This is Ancient Faith Radio, timeless Christianity, 24 hours a day.
Search the Scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospel.
This is Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Join us for an interactive verse-by-verse study of the Bible with one of Orthodoxy's most respected biblical scholars. Study along with us and share your comments and questions by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good, and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Well, good evening, dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to Search the Scriptures Live. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and we have a lot to talk about today because we're going to start a brand new study, which I think you're going to really love and get a lot out of. But before I forget, because I usually do, I will remind you that if you'd like to participate in our program with your comments or your questions, you can call us at 855-237-2346, and your call will be answered by the sweetest person in the world, certainly the sweetest, Matushka Trudy, who is not only engineering our program, but she got a promotion, people. She's the station manager of Ancient Faith Radio. We're very proud of her, and congratulations to Trudy. So she's the one who's answering your calls tonight if you want to call in, and frankly, most nights. She's always around. So I just want to give you a minute, just sort of update you momentarily about what I've been doing and what's coming up for me, in case you'd like to find me someplace or meet up with me someplace. A couple weeks ago, actually at the very end of September, beginning of October, I was in Edmonton, Alberta, where we were talking about thinking Orthodox at the St. Herman Orthodox Church there, a wonderful, very vibrant parish led by Father Vincent. And that was a terrific experience. Then I went down to Texas for the ROCOR Diocesan Conference of Chicago and Mid-America, and had a simply phenomenal time there with the clergy and many very devout lay people. And Vladika was there also. Then I went to Memphis, Tennessee. I was there about 10 days ago, and at the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation with Father Simon Thomas, who happens to be one of my former students when I was teaching at Holy Cross. And I'd like to thank them for their wonderful hospitality. We talked about thinking Orthodox there too, and Billy Benson was the organizer. Really phenomenal congregation. Really enjoyed that. And then on to St. Tikhon's, where I delivered a lecture. This was the Founders Day lecture at St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and I was able to spend about 3 days there, and that was really wonderful. I sat in on a couple of classes of Dr. Ford. Perhaps you heard last week's program was a live program with Dr. David Ford, who is a professor of church history there, And we just had a wonderful time talking about our favorite subject, one of our favorite subjects, St. John Chrysostom. And I've got to tell you, it was just a great experience getting to spend some time there, some time at the monastery, some time with students, and also with the dean there, Father John Parker. So they're doing wonderful work there. And then after that, I went to Minneapolis, where there's a very, very old church there, St. Mary's Orthodox Cathedral. There's two St. Mary's parishes. One is Greek, but this one is the OCA parish, where again I spoke about phronema and thinking Orthodox for what was called the Metropolitan Leonti lecture. And as part of my time there, spent some time with, because it was organized by a professor at the university there, Deacon Philip, Dr. Wagner, who is a professor there. And he also introduced me to some of the other Christian faculty there. They have a nice little organization. And also arranged for me to spend some time with the OCF there at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And that was a phenomenal group. Just had a wonderful time with them. And also, I spent a bit of time with some ladies who are involved in Orthodox prison ministry right there as part of that. So there's a very nice pan-Orthodox group, a lot of activities among all the Orthodox there in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so I got to tell you, it's just amazing. It's so wonderful to see all these people so involved in the work of the church, from students, regular college students who are part of OCF, and they're very, very impressive, very devout and dedicated to the church, and yet they are also preparing for, degrees, and they're studying science and medicine and all kinds of different subjects, and they're going to be wonderful lay leaders of our parish in the future. But also seeing what some of the seminarians, how they're approaching the church, and how with what devotion they're studying the faith there at St. Tikhon's, and even also some of the clergy wives and what they're sacrificing to support their husband, and then actually having a chance to catch up with one of my former students and see the work that he's doing there in Memphis. That's Father Simon. So I have to say, they thank me for coming there because they say that it's sort of a boost to them. But frankly, I really feel very encouraged also when I go out and see how many people are really doing wonderful work in the Orthodox Church here in America and Canada. So we have to remember that. And sometimes when things aren't going so well in our parish, we have a very myopic focus, or we hear about things happening in the church that might be a little bit wrong or scandalous or not as we would like them to be. That doesn't really define the church, and there are so many people doing such good work. And anyhow, I wanted to encourage all of you who are doing this kind of work in your parishes, whether you're visiting people in prisons or doing youth work, doing educational work, you're preparing for the priesthood, or you are a member of the clergy. Thank you for the work that you do, because it really makes a difference. Sometimes we get the feeling that our little efforts don't matter that much in the big scheme of things, but I think they really do. And we never know who we're touching and who we're influencing. So I want to encourage you to consider that and to continue your good work in the parish, which so many of you are doing. Anyhow, I was really impressed by all these people. At any rate, coming up this coming Saturday, because today is October 17th, this coming Saturday, I'm going to be in Murrieta, California, at the parish of St. Mary's Antiochian. So that's October 22nd. I'm going to be talking about thinking Orthodox in the afternoon. I think it starts in the afternoon. You're going to have to check that out yourself. This is a new little Antiochian parish out there. It's only been around for a few years. St. Mary's Antiochian in Murrieta. That's east of Los Angeles. If you're in SoCal, you know where that is. And then November 11th, 12th, and 13th, I'm going to be in Canton, Ohio, at the Greek Orthodox parish there. And that's one of my students is the priest there, one of my former students, Father Nick Halkias, and I'm going to be talking about the book of Revelation, actually. So if you're in the Ohio area, Cleveland, Canton, and these other areas up there in around the Great Lakes region, and you want to join us for a day where we're talking about the book of Revelation, it should be pretty interesting. I know I'm looking forward to it. And then the following week, November 18th, 19th, and 20th, I'm going to be in the St. Louis metro area, specifically Saints Constantine and Helen Greek Orthodox Parish, which is in Swansea, Illinois, but I've been told it's the metropolitan region of St. Louis. So if you're there and you want to stop by, we'll be talking about thinking Orthodox there too. Come and call those churches and find out the exact details and let them know if you're planning to come so they can plan accordingly. Anyhow, so I just thought I'd catch you up on what's going on with me. And of course, Father Costa just watches me take off and come back and take off and come back. He's very patient. So what are we starting that's brand new? It's the Gospel of Matthew. And it's been a while since we actually devoted ourselves to an in-depth study of a specific book of the Bible. I really couldn't think of anything better to talk about than Matthew's Gospel. And speaking of Father Costa, maybe we could get him to join us again. I'm sure we can at some point as we're talking about Matthew's Gospel. He said, do some of the text, but I don't think we're going to get to that today. He says, you be sure to cover some of the text. In other words, discuss the Bible part. But we're probably going to be just talking about background information. And Father Costa is inclined to think that that's not very interesting. But I think it's really interesting. And I want you to know it very well. Now, if you stick with me and you listen to these podcasts carefully and maybe listen to them again and maybe listen to them again, you're going to learn a lot about the Gospel of Matthew, about Jewish first century Judaism and how the Lord is interacting with the Jewish leaders of his day. This gospel is great for that. And the teachings of Christ, which are so profound, you're going to hear a lot about it. We're going to be talking about them. We're going to be approaching these things to some extent, obviously from a historical perspective, but also to draw out the spiritual meaning, especially using St. John Chrysostom. He's one of the reasons why I decided to do Matthew's Gospel instead of Luke, although Luke is very tempting. In the case of Matthew's Gospel, we have a complete set of homilies by St. John Chrysostom, so that's very, very useful to us. And by the way, he began, every time he would start a new book, he didn't start with the text right away. He would give background information about the book. That's why I'm doing that. I'm using him as my model. Not that I'm any comparison to St. John Chrysostom, but that's what he did first. First of all, he tried to get his congregation excited about the book, but he also talked about the setting and the purpose for which it was written. And you see, that's the exact kind of thing that any modern interpreter would do. So St. John Chrysostom used to do that a lot. And, well, that was his routine for him, never just to launch into the book, but give the background information. I was reading his very first homily on Matthew, and I had read it before, but it's been a long time, and it's phenomenal. I'm going to share some of that with you today, okay? But let's begin and let's launch our study of the first gospel. As a matter of fact, it's the very first book in the whole New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew. So this is one of the things we're going to talk about. Why are the Gospels first? Well, I think you probably know this. The Gospels are first in the New Testament because they contain the life, ministry, death, and resurrection, the teachings of Jesus Christ. That's the most important part of the New Testament. So we always focus on those. And when the priest comes out in the what's called the smaller procession or the lesser procession, he comes out with the book of the Gospels. It's not the whole New Testament. It's not the whole Bible. It's the Gospel, because we're getting ready to hear from Jesus Christ himself. And the words of Christ are almost exclusively found in the Gospels in the New Testament. There's a couple of places where other things are, where the words of Christ are found elsewhere. Can you think of them? I can think of two. One is in the book of Acts when St. Paul quotes the Lord saying, as the Lord said. Do you remember what it is? It is better to give than to receive. That's a very famous quotation, but it is not found in the Gospels. It's an example of one of the sayings of the Lord that was passed along orally And because St. Paul said it and Luke wrote that down in the book of Acts, that's how we know that statement. But otherwise, we would not have known about it. But it's so good, isn't it? Just think of all the other wonderful things the Lord said that weren't written down, but that's the reality. So besides that statement, where else are there words of the Lord in the New Testament other than the Gospels? I wonder if you could figure it out. I'm giving you a moment to think. Gold star if you can figure it out. It's in the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, because there, St. John has a vision of the one like the Son of Man who gives him certain instructions, especially the letters to the 7 churches where he's giving them, he's praising them or censuring them for what they're doing or not doing. But generally speaking, most of the words of the Lord are in the gospel. So we're going to get started with Matthew's gospel. Yes, it's the first. It's also significant for many other reasons, including the fact that Matthew's gospel is sometimes called the gospel of the church. Now, why is it called the gospel of the church? It's the only gospel that actually mentions the word church, and that's only 2 times. I wonder if you could figure out where the word church is found in Matthew's gospel. One of them is a very famous passage when the Lord blesses St. Peter and says, "Si e Petros, and on this Petra you are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church," right? And the gates of hell will not prevail against it. The other place where it's mentioned is later in chapter 18, when it's talking about disciplining people who are members of the church. If there's somebody who's doing something wrong, you're supposed to speak to him privately. And if he doesn't listen, take 2 or 3 people with you. And then if he doesn't listen still, you tell it to the church. Okay. So these are the only 2 places. It's hard to imagine because church is so important, right? Of course, St. Paul mentions the church many, many, many times, but the word church is actually only found in the Gospels in those 2 places in St. Matthew's Gospel. So it's very important, not just because it has the word church, but there's a lot in it of very important information and guidance for living the Christian life. Some of the most famous, and you could argue, probably the most famous passage in the Gospels is found in Matthew's Gospel, and that's the Sermon on the Mount. How important is that? How famous is that? Extremely important. Extremely famous, right? So let's go ahead and begin our study of Matthew's Gospel. Now, a while ago, I should have looked this up perhaps. I don't remember exactly how long ago, at least a couple of years ago. We did an overview of the New Testament, and we spent some time discussing all the books of the New Testament. And I told you about some of the features or characteristics of the Gospels. And I think that was a crash course on the Gospels. And that was a while ago, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. Crash course of the Gospels. So what I'm telling you may sound familiar, but that's okay. I'll be surprised if you remember everything. But this would be a very good thing for you to refamiliarize yourself with. So the Gospels all have certain things in common, but then they differ in how they present Jesus, and they differ in their style and their characteristics and, other things like this. It's good for us to know these things. It's good for us to be familiar with the Gospels and the particular characteristics and personalities and interests and audience of each evangelist. We have 4 Gospels, not 1, for a reason, because each of them presents his own vision, his own explanation or interpretation of who Jesus is. Of course, they're in agreement. It's not like one says Jesus is the Son of God and the other one doesn't. It's not like that at all. But nonetheless, they each give us a different nuance, a different portrait in a way, because they each emphasize something different about Jesus Christ. And in Matthew's Gospel, it's the Jewishness of Jesus that is emphasized. And so in many respects, I think that Matthew's Gospel gives us a much clearer picture, a very strong picture of Jesus as a rabbi in first century Palestine. So let's talk about the author, Matthew. Well, first of all of the Gospels in biblical studies, we tend to say they are anonymous. Why would we say that when at the top of the page it says Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Well, in biblical studies, if something isn't signed, if the author does not identify himself in the work itself, it is called anonymous, even if we know who wrote it. Paul's letters are not anonymous because the very first word in all of his letters is Paul. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, etc. Or the book of Revelation is not anonymous because the author says, I, John, your brother, or says John to the 7 churches of Asia, so it's not anonymous. The Gospels, however, are technically speaking anonymous. Now, how do we know who wrote them if they were technically anonymous, if they were unsigned? Now, letters were signed, just like letters are today. Usually anonymous letters are not sent. So letters were signed and we know who wrote them. But the Gospels, in the Gospels, the author does not reveal himself. And why is that? Because they never imagined that particular gospel would be read by millions of people over hundreds of years, over 2,000 years. Matthew wrote his gospel for his own little community there, wherever it was, and then he left to become a missionary like all the other apostles, and everybody knew who wrote it, so nobody felt like they needed to sign it. So that's actually the norm. Each of the evangelists were just writing for their own local church. They never imagined that these gospels would be so studied that they would last as long as they did, even that it would take so long for the Lord to come back. The people would be studying these gospels. And they never thought, even if they did, I don't think they would have thought that they were that important, that we should be talking about them, right? Because the important one is the Lord. So how do we know who wrote which gospel? Well, that information was preserved orally in the church. And by the way, this is something which you can say to your friends who are Protestants who believe in only sola scriptura, because in none of these in none of these manuscripts, in none of the copies, does the author actually identify himself. At the top, at the beginning, or at the end, it might say the gospel according to Matthew, but he didn't write that. You see, he just wrote the gospel. So this information was known within the church. Like many, many things, it didn't have to be written down. It was very well known. So there is some information about a couple of the Gospels before the year 100 in a letter by Clement, who was the Bishop of Rome. That letter is called First Clement. But also by no later than the year 120, there was another bishop whose name was Papias, Papias, of Hierapolis. And he recorded for us who wrote which gospel. And that's pretty early, 120, because it's within the lifetime of the people who actually wrote these gospels. Okay, it's not like, it sounds like, oh, that's really, really late. I want you to remember that even if he's writing in 120, that's not the first time that he heard about it. He didn't have to investigate, oh, I wonder who wrote these gospels. It was part of the living memory of the church. We know that Christians were reading these gospels, and as they copied them, then they put the name on it, you see, but who wrote them was very well known, okay? So this particular one is the very first gospel ever written, and that is Matthew's gospel. Now, that's why Matthew's gospel is first. That's why he is given this place of prominence among the gospels to be given this first place. He wrote the first gospel. Now, perhaps you went to school and you studied something about the Bible, and you will say, well, what about Markan priority? That's a famous theory in biblical studies that the oldest gospel we have today is by Mark, and that's frankly the prevailing theory among most Bible scholars. Well, here's the problem with that. The problem with that, even though it's a very strong, there are very good reasons for the theory, the problem with that is that the ancient tradition of the church is incredibly strong when it comes to this tradition that Matthew wrote first. A lot of people mention it. And here's what they say. They said that Matthew wrote the first gospel in the Hebrew tongue, and people translated it as best as they could. Now, the word Hebrew sometimes was just another way of saying Aramaic. So we don't know if it was actually in Hebrew or Aramaic, which was a more common form, a kind of a less sort of erudite form of Hebrew at the time. The common spoken form of Hebrew was Aramaic, but it's very, very close to Hebrew. So that is the ancient tradition of the church. Everybody says that. All of the early witnesses, Papias, and then later people like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr and other people all said that Matthew wrote first in the Hebrew tongue. Now, where is that gospel? We don't know. We don't have it. Does that mean it never existed? Of course not. It just means it didn't survive. Now, why wouldn't that gospel survive? And these are good questions to have. So when I say it didn't survive, actually, if it was discovered, that would be probably the greatest discovery in biblical studies ever. If they were ever to discover an existing copy of Matthew's gospel in Hebrew. We know it existed because a lot of people talk about it. And some people report actually having seen the Jewish version of Matthew's gospel. Other writers, people like Origen and others. And I think even Jerome mentions that. So that's up to the year 400. So if it's so important, because it was the very, very first gospel written, why didn't it survive? Well, because the church went from being overwhelmingly Jewish. In other words, these were Jewish Christians like Matthew. Matthew was a Jewish Christian. All of the apostles were Jewish Christians. Mary, the mother of the Lord, she was a Jewish Christian. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, Mary and Martha, Lazarus, all these people were Jewish Christians. They spoke Hebrew, or Aramaic. They would have been able to read it. But within a relatively short period of time, the number of Jewish Christians is far exceeded by the number of Gentile Christians, or even if they're not just Gentile Christians, the number of Jews who spoke Greek and not Hebrew far exceeded the number of Hebrew-speaking Jews in the first century. And that's really hard for us to imagine because we sort of think of Hebrew and Judaism go together, and they always have, and that's actually not true. So most Jews in the time of Christ did not know Hebrew. They spoke Greek. They were what we call Hellenized or Hellenistic Jews. And so they read the Septuagint. So if you have people who are joining this church and they don't know Hebrew, how many people are going to be able to read that Hebrew gospel of Matthew? So over a period of time, fewer and fewer people would be able to read it. So what difference does that make? Well, the difference it makes is that without people reading it, it's not going to be copied. So books survived because they were important to people. And the more important the book was, the more copies were made because people would read it and study it. So the largest number of copies of any ancient Greek work, other than the books of the Bible, other than the Gospels and the New Testament and Septuagint, anything that's not religious, is the Iliad. Okay, because that was a very important story in Greek antiquity. So there are a lot of copies of that. But other ancient Greek works, even by famous people like Aristotle or Plato, they only exist in one manuscript copy, or a handful of manuscript copies. So the more important a book was, the more copies were made. So let's go back to Matthew's Hebrew gospel. Was it important? Yeah. But if people, after a while, there were fewer and fewer Jewish Christians who actually read Hebrew. So it wasn't copied. And if it wasn't copied, it might have simply fallen apart. Whatever copies did exist, I'm sure there were multiple copies. And there's something else. Even if they did not fall apart or weren't destroyed over the course of time, if you don't know Hebrew and you have a copy, one of these manuscript copies of Matthew's gospel, you just look at it, you don't even know what it is because you can't read it, right? So it could be that if someone knew that it was Matthew's gospel in Hebrew, they might have tried to copy it even if they didn't really know the Hebrew letters. But if you don't even know what it is, it's not going to be copied. So over the course of time, that Hebrew version of Matthew's gospel was lost. Now, this is the reason why we're talking about this is which gospel is first. So while Bible scholars today say that Mark's is the oldest gospel we have, we know that Matthew wrote the first gospel in Hebrew. Now, that doesn't survive. How closely did it match the Greek version of Matthew's gospel, which is what we have today? No one knows because we don't have the original Hebrew, okay? So that's all I can say about that. But it is good for you to know that Matthew wrote the first gospel in the Hebrew language, and people kind of translated it as best they could. And then we have, at some point, a Greek version of Matthew's gospel was made, okay? And that's the one that we're going to be using for our study. So we've been discussing Matthew's gospel for half an hour now. So why don't we take a little break? And when we come back, we're going to continue and we will talk about what we know about this author and his audience. Who was he writing to? Why did he write? And then we will discuss some other aspects about the background information, such as the main themes and some very interesting characteristics that are unique to Matthew's gospel. So join me after the break, okay?
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronema. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronema is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronema is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
All right, so let us continue discussing Matthew, the author of the first gospel. So what do we know about him? Of course, he was one of the 12, one of the closest disciples to Jesus. And it's interesting that in the call of Matthew, we know that he describes his own calling, and he calls himself Matthew, that he was the publican, he was the tax collector or the toll collector sitting in the tax collector's booth, and Jesus said, "Follow me," and Matthew got up and followed him. So that story is told in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But Mark and Luke both call him Levi. In Matthew's gospel, he calls himself Matthew. So why is that? Did he have two names, or did he change his name at some point and take the name Matthew? He is the only one who refers to himself as Matthew. Was he just of the tribe of Levi, or was that his actual name? It's really impossible to say. But we do know that this author is a very intelligent person. very, very detail-oriented. It certainly fits with somebody who might have been a tax collector or like an accountant. Accountants and engineers, they have that reputation of being very, very detail-oriented, very, very precise. And we certainly see that in Matthew's gospel, and incredible structure and symmetry in his gospel. So we can also tell from this gospel that this author is a Jewish Christian. He is not a Gentile, and he is not writing for Gentiles. That's very, very obvious. His gospel is full of Jewish images, full of Jewish discussions, Jewish concerns. The way the Lord answers questions in this gospel are in a very typical Jewish manner, something that we don't see in Luke and Mark. And when we get to those passages, I'll tell you about that. I'll describe the way the same issue is framed in Mark and Luke versus how Matthew tells the story. So this person was extremely well educated, seems to know the law of Moses very, very well. He certainly knows the Jewish traditions, and he's very interested in those traditions. And you can understand why, because those first believers were all Jews. And initially, when they accepted Jesus Christ as the Lord, as the Messiah, they never said, well, we're not Christian, we're not Jews anymore, we're Christians. They simply accepted Jesus Christ, and they continued to live in the same manner as they always had. They continued to keep the dietary regulations and observe the Sabbath and go to the temple for the certain feast days of the Jews and things like that. So they didn't change dramatically in their way of life. That didn't happen. They just accepted that Jesus was the Lord and the Messiah, and they proclaimed that, and they also met together as a separate community. All right. So we see, and yet we can see that there would inevitably be certain questions or conflicts that would arise. And one of those has to do with the fact that the Lord was not very into ritual purity, right? He gets criticized by the Pharisees for not washing their hands in a ritual manner, for allowing the disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath, for healing on the Sabbath, for touching lepers, for being willing to enter the house of a Gentile. So these kinds of things were really serious violations of the law. And so the Jewish Christians, after the time of the Lord, really had to sort of come to terms with, how are we supposed to be Jews with this Messiah? What rules are we supposed to follow? What are the parameters that we're supposed to follow? And Matthew does a lot to address that. And you can really see why that would be a prime area of concern for the Jewish Christians in the first century. Because they didn't give up being Jewish, just because they accepted Jesus Christ. Of course not. It's perfectly natural for a Jew to accept the Messiah. So, what do we see with Matthew's gospel? Somebody who's extremely intelligent, very well versed in the law, but also a devout Christian who's able to explain these things, and who is also called, he's so organized, he's given a couple of nicknames, not by the Lord, but by scholars. Some people call him the Scribe of the Kingdom of Heaven. And that's because a scribe was a person who was an expert in the law. When we say scribe, usually think of someone who can write, make copies of books, for example. But for the Jews, the scribes were also called the lawyers, or that's what Mark calls them. Sometimes Luke calls them lawyers. That means they were experts in the law of Moses, all of the rituals and the regulations and the requirements of Jewish life as preserved in the law of Moses, the written law and the oral traditions. So those were the scribes. But Matthew is the scribe of the kingdom of heaven because he's an expert in that. And another nickname that is sometimes applied to Matthew is Meticulous Matthew, because of the extraordinary amount of detail and structure within his gospel. Now, where did he write his gospel? The story is that before Matthew left, all of the disciples, they stayed around in Jerusalem for a while, all the apostles. Then eventually they began to branch out and go to other parts of the world. But the story is that before he left, the congregation asked Matthew to write down these things about Jesus Christ, that they would have it to read after Matthew was gone. This is the story. And of course, that makes perfect sense. And it also explains why he wrote a gospel at all, because we sometimes think, well, of course you would write it down, but it really wasn't a natural thing that would come to somebody's mind. I need to write this down. We're very, very attached to writing and reading, but people in the early church, people in antiquity, were not sort of wedded to writing. They really relied on oral instruction. This is how people learned. So it was a bit unusual, actually, for them to ask Matthew to undertake this, because this was a complicated gospel. This is a very, by far exceeding any other gospel, by any measure. This gospel is by far the most complex, okay? And as we go through, I'll be showing you how it is complex. So this was a tremendous effort on the part of Matthew, but he left it behind as a consolation for those of his community that he would be leaving behind as he continued traveling and preaching as an apostle. Apostles weren't supposed to stay in one place. They were supposed to constantly be traveling. Now, so we don't know exactly where he was when he wrote it. There are some people who say he was in Palestine. It kind of makes sense because that's where most of the Jewish Christians were. But I'm also inclined to think that it might have been Antioch, because of the prominence of St. Peter in this gospel. It is Matthew's gospel that has Jesus blessing Peter the way he did. You, Peter, flesh and blood, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. Matthew's gospel is also the one that mentions Peter. Every three gospels have the storm and the stilling of the storm, but only Matthew's gospel has Peter coming out on the waves. If it's really you, bid me to come out to you. And Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out and starts walking on the water. That story is unique to Matthew. It's what we call redactional to Matthew. So Peter was closely identified with Antioch. So even though today, especially in the Catholic Church, they identify him with Rome, he spent more time in Antioch, was very prominent in Antioch. Much more so than Rome. He died in Rome, of course, like Paul, but he was really more associated in the early church with Antioch. So could it have been in Antioch? I think it's possible. And Antioch would have had a significant Jewish Christian population. Likewise, in Asia Minor, wherever there was a large Jewish population, there was also a larger Jewish Christian population, not larger than the Jews, but of a significant size. So there were areas of the Roman Empire where there were a lot of Jews, Asia Minor included, Antioch included, Alexandria, Egypt also, and Babylon. And then where you have these large Jewish populations, you're also going to have some among them who accept the apostolic preaching and believe that Jesus really is the Messiah. So the more Jews that are in that area, the more Jewish Christians you're going to have as part of your church. Okay. So speaking of Jewish Christians, let's talk about Matthew's audience. Who is it? Who is Matthew writing for? Absolutely, it's for Jewish Christians or for Jews, just to convince them about Jesus Christ, definitely about Jewish Christians. And this is because it's so obvious that the audience is Jewish, and for many factors. First of all, there's a strong emphasis on proving that Jesus is Son of David, the Messiah. Now, is Jesus the Messiah in Mark, Luke, and John? Yes, of course. But Matthew emphasizes this, especially with certain terminologies and traditions. He begins his gospel by emphasizing how Jesus is descended from Abraham, because the Jews are sons of Abraham, and then through David. Why? Because the Messiah has to be descended from David. We see other things that clearly indicate a Jewish Christian audience. There are certain Aramaic words that, at least in the Greek original, they are untranslated. He doesn't bother to explain what they are. That means that the reader knows what it is, okay? When we get to those passages, I will discuss them. Again, this fascination with, or this obsession with, the law of Moses. What kind of laws do we still have to keep, and why? What is the reason for this? So these issues are discussed in Matthew's gospel. The idea of the law, the questions that are posed to Jesus is very frequently, Rabbi, is it lawful to, and then they fill in the blank. Is it lawful to do this, that, or the other thing? So this is, again, something that was of great interest, very, very important to Jewish Christians. What else? How does Matthew prove that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, he does it by showing that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. That's the important thing. So Matthew has far more quotations from the Jewish scriptures than any of the others. As a matter of fact, I haven't counted this myself, but it is said that Matthew's gospel has twice as many quotations from the Jewish scriptures, in other words, what we call the Old Testament, than the other three evangelists combined. And I would not doubt that. Because if you have a Jewish Christian audience, or let's say a Jewish audience, let's say they're not Christians yet, they're just a Jewish audience, and you want to prove to them that Jesus is a Messiah, how are you going to do that? There's only one way. There's only one way to prove that Jesus is the Messiah, that he fulfilled the prophecies. So Matthew emphasizes this a lot. And I know you've heard this kind of language, so now it's time for you to remember where you heard it. What kind of language is that? Language that says things like, this was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Oh, Bethlehem, land of Judah, or he shall be called a Nazarene, or the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. All of those places, you're familiar with that language because you hear it every year at Christmas time, right? This was done to fulfill. So that is typical of Matthew. He tells you that this thing happened in fulfillment of prophecy, and then he quotes the prophecy for you. He does that a lot. So you can see that this is a Jewish audience or Jewish Christian. They're the ones that care about this. Gentile Christians, people who used to worship idols, don't know about these prophecies, or not at first, when they first joined, and they don't really care. But for the Jews, it's very important. This is how you prove who Jesus is, okay? So what else have we got here? So the Jewish Christian audience. What is the purpose of Matthew's gospel? Well, of course, all authors write with a purpose. And what is the purpose of Matthew's gospel? The purpose is to show that Jesus is the Son of God, that his prophecies are, that the prophecies about Jesus as the Son of God, the Messiah that was promised, are being fulfilled. Okay? So Jesus in Matthew's gospel is Christos. He is the Messiah. And the Greek word for that is Christos, or Christ. He is Son of David. Because he's the Messiah, he has other messianic titles, like Son of David. He is, of course, as the Messiah, descended from David, he is King of the Jews. He is the Son of God. So all of these things are things that are very, very important in Matthew's gospel. And this is what he's emphasizing about Jesus Christ. Now, here again, are we saying that Matthew says that Jesus is Son of God, Son of David, King of the Jews, but not Luke, Mark, or John? Of course not. He is all those things. But Matthew emphasizes them in a specific way by, especially, for example, as Messiah, by emphasizing that Jesus was called Son of David. Well, he's called Son of David in all the Gospels, really, but more so in Matthew's Gospel. So sometimes it's a matter of emphasis. It's not that one Gospel, one evangelist is unique, but that it's a matter of emphasis, all right? So let's go ahead and talk about some of the themes that we will see here in Matthew's Gospel. The first one we could say, and these are not in any particular order, but one of them is about fulfillment, the fulfillment of prophecy. And where do we see that? We see it in the way that I just described, that Matthew likes to quote the Old Testament scriptures and then to tell us that these prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus. And he usually or almost always does this by introducing the prophecy with a little formulaic statement. And we call that a fulfillment formula. So, for example, I already gave you the example. This was done to, this was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. That little statement, and this occurred to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, or as it was spoken by the prophet. So depending upon the exact place, usually it says something like, this was done to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, and then Matthew quotes it. He quotes the exact prophecy. So fulfillment is a very strong theme, not only in these what are called fulfillment formulas, a formulaic statement that is used to introduce the prophecy itself, but also that the word fulfill and fulfillment is something that comes up with some regularity in the gospel. For example, when Jesus comes to be baptized by John, and John says, I should be baptized by you. You should not be baptized by me. Jesus says what? Let it be so, that we might fulfill all righteousness, right? Or I came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. These statements that I just quoted to you come only from the Gospel of Matthew. So you can see from his language how important this theme of fulfillment is for Matthew. So the first thing is fulfillment. Again, not in any particular order. Number 2, authority. Jesus's authority. How does the gospel end? Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Or before he heals the paralytic man, he says, that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Get up, take up your bed and walk. So the idea of Jesus' authority, the word authority is often used. By what authority do you do these things? He's challenged. Jesus speaks about his authority. But it's also the stories that are shown or depicted or described by Matthew in which we see the authority that Jesus has received from God to do the work, God the Father, to do the work that he's come to earth to do. So the word authority is itself often used, but if it's not the word itself, it's also in the stories that are told that show the tremendous authority that Jesus had over the wind and the rain, over demons and things like this. Number 3. The third main theme is the kingdom of heaven. So what's with this? The kingdom of heaven. Well, only Matthew's gospel uses that term. If you're ever in church listening to the gospel and you hear kingdom of heaven, for sure you're in Matthew's gospel. You're hearing Matthew's gospel being read because Mark and Luke say kingdom of God. But Matthew, in a very typical fashion, avoids referring to God directly. So this was very common and still is among the Jews today. So one of my friends, who's Jewish, she would never write out the word God. If she was going to talk about God in an email or something, she would put capital G, a little dash, and the letter D. She never even wrote the word God, let alone say the word God, because this is considered, disrespectful. So they never directly refer to God. It's an act of piety, okay? But that's their tradition. So they don't use the word God. So instead of referring to God, they say all kinds of other things that are meant to indicate God without saying God, like the mighty one of Jacob, the Holy One of Israel, the name Hashem, okay? The name, that's just, heaven above, or just heaven. So may heaven bless you, that kind of a thing. You don't realize it, but that's a Jewish expression, because we pick this up from the scriptures, not realizing why the Jews, rather than saying God bless you, they will say may heaven bless you, may the Holy One of Israel bless you, may the name bless you. So this kind of a thing. So kingdom of heaven, how is an important theme for Matthew's gospel. How do you attain the kingdom of heaven? What is the kingdom of heaven? What is Jesus' relationship to it? And right in the middle of the gospel, in chapter 13, we have several parables about the kingdom of heaven. This has something to do with Matthew's teaching, but we haven't gotten to that yet. Number 4, righteousness. Righteousness, there are other themes we could pull out, but we're going to stick to these. Righteousness is very important because that's what Jews were aiming at. What does it mean to be righteous? The Pharisees thought that they had a certain kind of righteousness and that theirs was the best, right? And Jesus says to the disciples, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And they were totally flabbergasted by that. So there is this idea of righteousness, because that's the life that the Jew is trying to live, a righteous life. In other words, to be righteous means that you're accepted by God. So this is one of the things that they were always talking about. And again, going back to that scene of Jesus's baptism, John says, you should baptize me, not me baptize you. And Jesus said, let it be so, that we might fulfill all righteousness, right? Okay, so there you go. Now, what else do we have? We have Jesus as the new Moses. This is another theme that we see in this gospel. How is Jesus, and why would he be the new Moses? Do we really need another Moses? Well, think about the fact that Moses was the most important person who gave the Jewish religion its shape and its way of life. Yes, Abraham is the father of the nation, but Moses is the great lawgiver of Israel. After Moses liberates them from Egypt, after Moses liberates them and brings them out into the mountain, to Mount Sinai, they receive the law. And ever since then, they're supposed to live a specific kind of life. So Moses is the great lawgiver. And since Judaism is all about following these laws, living in a certain way that's observant of these laws, now the question becomes, what would Jesus say about these laws? Does he have his own laws? Are we supposed to keep these laws or not? So the idea of Jesus as the new Moses who comes and brings us his laws that are very different from what Moses said in a lot of ways. So Jesus is new Moses. How do we see that? How do we see that? First of all, we see him teaching from a mountain. And in Matthew's gospel, that is called the Sermon on the Mount. We see Jesus as an infant being persecuted by a king who's killing a lot of little boys around where Jesus is living. That's called the Massacre of the Innocents. That's very similar to what happened in the lifetime of Moses, right? When Pharaoh killed the Jewish baby boys. And then he has to flee to Egypt, and then he comes out of Egypt. So there are certain parallels to Moses that are very important, all right? And then also one of the themes is the law of Moses. As we mentioned, questions about the law come up, and they are framed in Matthew's gospel in the way that a rabbi would challenge another rabbi. Rabbi, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, right? Is it lawful? They'll ask him, and then they expect him to give a reply that's supported by Jewish law. So the way that they frame the questions and the fact that people come to Jesus as a rabbi, very concerned and very interested in keeping the law of Moses, and they ask these kinds of questions. Is it lawful to? Now, again, it's not that you won't ever hear that question in Mark, Luke, and John, but almost always, or certainly more often, you'll hear it in Matthew's gospel. And Matthew gives Jesus the opportunity to answer that question and give people an understanding of how you're supposed to live as a Jewish Christian in the church, still respecting and embracing your Judaism, but not living as somebody who never knew Christ, all right? And then the last theme we can see is the theme of discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple? And the first place where we see this is in chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. And that is a description of true discipleship. And then other aspects having to do with discipleship are seen later in the book in chapter 18, all right? So let's take a little break there. And when we return, we will discuss some of the characteristics of Matthew's style, okay? So join me after the break.
Dr. Constantinou will be back in a moment, but the lines are open for your calls. The number is 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hi, I'm author Sarah Byrne Martelli, and I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Memory Eternal: Living with Grief as Orthodox Christians. Losing someone we love is never easy, but the Orthodox Church provides a wealth of resources that help us to bear it. I draw on these theological, scriptural, and liturgical resources, as well as the collected experience of a variety of people undergoing grief and loss, to provide a kind of roadmap to the grieving process. I also include an 8-week bereavement curriculum that can be used in a group or on one's own. As Orthodox Christians, we do not seek to get over grief, but to carry the memory of our loved ones eternally in our hearts. Memory Eternal is now available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We are back with Search the Scriptures Live with Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. Have a question about the verses we are studying tonight? Give her a call at 855-237-2346. Here once again is Dr. Jeannie.
All right, so we are discussing Matthew's Gospel, and we're discussing some of the background of Matthew's Gospel. And now we're at the point where we're talking about what are his style or characteristics of his style, because each of the evangelists had a different writing style. Well, perhaps the most, there are two, I would say, characteristics of Matthew's Gospel that are especially striking. The first is how carefully structured his Gospel is. I'm going to be pointing this out to you as we go through, but I'll never be able to completely capture it by explaining it vocally. You'd have to see charts that describe the structure of Matthew's Gospel. But the most obvious structure is that we call it, he begins with the birth narratives, the infancy narratives, the birth of Jesus Christ, and then, of course, he ends with the passion and resurrection, right? So those two ends of Matthew's Gospel, the very beginning and the very end, sometimes we call those book ends. Like if you can imagine pile of books, you stand them up and you put something heavy on each end to hold them together. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Those are the bookends. The infancy narratives, chapters 1 and 2, the Passion and Resurrection, chapters 26, 27, and 28. In between, Matthew's Gospel is divided up into 5 main sections. And most people think that's not an accident. He might be sort of imitating the 5 books of Moses, or at least giving a sort of honor to the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, in other words, or the Torah. So each of these 5 main sections is characterized by a narrative, that is, certain story, so things happen, and then there's a teaching section. Jesus just talks for a very long period of time. Then the narrative begins again. In other words, the story resumes, and then Jesus just stops and gives a long section in which is just teaching. And then the narrative resumes, and then there's teaching and narrative, teaching, narrative, teaching. This happens 5 times. It is so obvious. This is not an accident. He structured the gospel in this way. Now, what this also means is that he gathered together certain teachings of the Lord on similar themes or the same theme, and he put them all together in one place. So if you read Mark or Luke, Jesus is walking around, he's encountering people, and he gives some kind of a teaching. He tells a parable or something like this, and then he moves on to the next event where he asked a question and he gives a teaching. So it's very casual. It's probably more natural, but Matthew doesn't follow that. Instead, Matthew takes all of the teachings about certain subjects and brings them together. So Matthew has crafted these discourses or these long teaching sections very effectively, by the way. And now that doesn't mean it's not true. All right. Don't get hung up on the fact that Matthew shaped the way Jesus tells a story. It's all the words of the Lord, but people didn't sit down with a video camera or a recording device and record exactly what Jesus said as though it has to be presented in this way, in this order, etc. He didn't do that. It's still the words and teachings of the Lord, but Matthew and other early writers felt free to shape these things. Remember, when Matthew was writing this gospel, he's not saying, I am writing the first book of the New Testament. This shall be called a gospel. He doesn't do that. He has no idea what's going to happen, that this is going to become the first book in what's called the New Testament eventually. He has no idea. So he's just writing something which is intended to be a reminder for the community that he's leaving about the things that he taught them about Jesus Christ, all right? So he alternates between narrative and teaching, narrative and teaching. Now, in each one of those big main sections, he has subsections. And within each of those, there are smaller subsections, and they're very carefully crafted so that they're quite balanced. And it's kind of hard to describe this, but it's something that in biblical studies we call a chiasm. Now, you're excused if you forget this. It's kind of technical. A chiasm is a structure within a book that's actually pretty common, where you say something and then you make another point, and then you arrive like at a high point in their discussion, and then you repeat the second point, and then you repeat the initial point. And they call it a chiasm because the Greek word X, he is called chi by people, C-H-I. So in other words, you're trying to make an argument or make a point, and it's structured like a poem. You have A, B, B, D, D, or C, C. So you'll have, how you analyze the structure of a poem. Well, here it will be A, B, C, then C hash, or A, B, C, D, and then C hash, B hash, and A hash, if you know what I'm saying, if you follow what I'm saying. In other words, there's a very definitive structure, and it's so complex in Matthew's gospel. There are structures and smaller structures and smaller structures and others. It's just mind-blowing. And this is why he's called Meticulous Matthew. I won't be able to describe it for you in words, but trust me that it's there. Definitely, we will be describing as we go from one of the main sections to the next. I will show you how he's making the transition and he's bringing the reader along. And there are sort of linguistic clues to that. He's giving you a clue that he's moving on from the teaching section to the narrative section. And then from the narrative section, he sits down and begins teaching again, all right? So this is very different from what we see in Mark and Luke, which it's just more kind of organic, much more natural, where Jesus is walking around, talking to people, giving his teachings, and encountering other people, giving certain teachings. They don't really craft great sermons, but that's what we have in the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is very, very carefully crafted by Matthew. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't say it again, so don't get hung up on that if that makes you uncomfortable. This is all the sayings of Jesus, but gospel writers felt free to shape the story, to bring all the teachings of the Lord together in one place on this particular subject. And what's the subject matter? How to be a disciple. What is expected of disciples? It's all about discipleship in the Sermon on the Mount. So the other thing, so we mentioned that's Matthew's structure, which is incredibly impressive because it's so complex and so detailed. We have that. And the other thing that maybe is really, really striking is that Matthew has very little narrative description. I'm going to be showing this to you also as we go through these stories. I will give you one example. In the case of the woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years, remember the one who wants to ask Jesus for healing, but she's afraid to, and so she goes behind him and she's thinking to herself, if I could only touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed, right? And so she does. Now, in both Mark and Luke, this is a very dramatic scene. Jesus feels the touch, and then he stops and he looks around and he says, who touched me? And he's looking around to say, the disciples are like, what are you talking about? Look at this big crowd. Everybody's pressing on you. Everybody's trying to touch you. What do you mean? And Jesus says, somebody touched me. And he's looking around. And then the woman realizes she's been discovered and she comes forward and she's trembling and frightful and fearful. And she tells the whole story, etc. So this is a very dramatic scene, and not in Matthew's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, we find out about the woman, what she's thinking. She touches the fringe of his garment, and Jesus turns around and says, my daughter, your faith has made you well, and he just goes on. The whole thing is told in like 3 sentences, okay? Matthew doesn't really care about the drama of the story. Mark is all about the drama, all about the emotion of the story, all the stories. Matthew is just absolutely bare bones. You know, have you ever had a friend who you want to say, well, tell me all about what was it like when you visited Moscow or something like this? And they say, yeah, it was really nice. We went to a bunch of churches, and you know, we saw we saw this and that other, and then we came home. You know, there got to be more to it than this. They just give you the bare bones. It's just not enough. Matthew does not. Matthew is much more interested in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus is the new Moses in Matthew's gospel. The primary emphasis in the gospel is about the teachings of Christ, not so much about the miracles. Now, the miracles occur. They're definitely there, as many as Mark has. So there's plenty of miracles in Matthew's gospel, but Matthew doesn't go into a lot of detail describing what happened because that's not the most important thing. The important thing is that the miracle did happen. But the miracles that we see in Matthew's gospel show that Jesus has the authority to teach the way he does. Just think about that. It's all about Jesus's teaching. Jesus is giving very, very strong teachings on very strong authority. And the miracles are intended to show that Jesus has that kind of authority to teach the way he does, you see. So, now, what other characteristics do we see in Matthew's gospel? Other characteristics that we see are the tremendous numbers of Old Testament quotations and what we call fulfillment formulas. I already mentioned this to you. So very, very frequently, Matthew chooses to quote the prophecies and show how Jesus has fulfilled the prophecies. And he introduces these prophecies by saying, this occurred to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, or something very similar to that. And that introductory statement, we call it a fulfillment formula. I'm going to say that term a lot. So get used to it. It's nice for you to say it out loud. When I say something, it's good for you to repeat it. and try to repeat it out loud. That helps you to remember. So, for example, whenever I give a term and you want to try to remember it, or you want to remember something as simple as, even though this is English, fulfillment formula, say it out loud after I've said it. That's a fulfillment formula. Or if you're in church and you're hearing Matthew's gospel read and you're hearing those words, and so was occurred to fulfill what was, or so was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet, and say to yourself, fulfillment formula. Okay. So another characteristic of Matthew's gospel, which I personally find very striking, is how carefully he chooses his words and the repetition of key words. This is something else which I will be pointing out to you. What do I mean by key words? Well, one of them you're very familiar with, even if you don't know it. It's the word proskino, to bow down in worship. When we say in church, Vefte proskinisomen, come let us worship and bow down to God our King. Oh, come let us worship. Or when the priest comes out with, that's at the start of a Vesper service, when the priest comes out with the Gospels and says, come let us worship and fall down before Christ, it is not the words worship and fall down before. That's 5 words. It's one word in Greek. It's the word proskino. And sometimes it's translated as venerate, sometimes it's translated as worship, but it means to fall down before in an act of homage. Okay, that's what the way a person would show respect for a king or something. They would get down on their knees and put their head on the ground. Okay, that's the word proskino. So Matthew uses this word a lot. And it's one of the ways that he emphasizes the divinity of Christ. So, for example, in Mark's gospel, we have the man with the son who is an epileptic, right? It's called the Epileptic Demoniac. The boy who was falling into the fire and into the water, and he was rolling about with foaming at the mouth, and the disciples couldn't cast it out. So the father comes and asks Jesus to help him and says, Jesus says, if all things are possible to those who believe. And the father said, I believe, help my unbelief. Remember that story? Okay, that's called typically the Epileptic Demoniac. Well, of course, Mark has a lot more description, and Matthew has almost no description at all. But when Mark describes, or Luke describes, the father of the boy coming to Jesus, they will say he knelt down in front of Jesus. But Matthew says he uses the verb proskino, and that means that he's showing that the father recognized something divine about Jesus. And that word is also used at the very beginning of the gospel, when the Magi came to show honor, to reverence Jesus. That's the word that's used. Okay, so it's something that we see a lot of in Matthew's gospel, but it's very, very deliberate. And so it's one of these words that's repeated a lot. Other words that are repeated a lot are words like follow, authority, lawful, fulfill, disciple, faith. So certain words keep getting repeated, and they form a beautiful melody in this gospel. And it really shows Matthew's attention to detail. These are the themes that he's trying to bring out, but one of the ways that he brings it out is by the constant repetition of these words that float through his gospel. And you hear them again and again and again. Like musical notes, like musical themes, these words come up again and again and again, and they just reinforce what he's saying. All right, so what else do we see in Matthew's gospel? We see that he has, in terms of the number of chapters, this is the longest gospel with 28 chapters. I always call it the longest gospel because I think it's good for us to remember who has how many chapters. But it has been noted, and it is true, that in terms of actual length, in terms of the number of words, Luke's gospel is actually longer. Luke's gospel has 24 chapters, but he tends to have some longer chapters. But we're going to say that Matthew's is the longest because it has the greatest number of chapters, or the largest number of chapters. Now, what else is characteristic? Concern with Jewish issues. Matthew is very concerned about Jewish issues, about lawfulness and what it means to be a Jewish Christian follower of Jesus Christ, the number of Old Testament allusions and quotations, and also the fact that overall this gospel has a very Jewish flavor to it. And in this gospel, Jesus seems to be emphasizing that he has come for the Jewish people. This is the gospel that says, I have come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Or when he sends out the disciples, he says, don't go to the Samaritan towns, don't go to any Gentile towns, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that this is really his mission. And it's a very Jewish-oriented gospel. However, there is something positive about and for the Gentiles in this gospel, because this is the gospel that ends with Jesus on the mountaintop saying to the disciples, go out and baptize all nations, go out and preach to all nations, right? Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, baptize them, teach them, etc. They're supposed to take the gospel throughout the world. So even though during his lifetime in his ministry, Jesus is just focused on the Jews, and I think from a practical perspective, we can understand that why that would be the case, because he can't really have a mixed ministry because of the Jewish sensitivities to ritual and purity. They could never have been traveling around with Gentiles, for example. That couldn't happen. So in his actual ministry, Jesus is definitely focused on the Jews, but then also he opens up the gospel to everyone in the whole world at the end. But even before that, Jesus encounters some Gentiles in this gospel, Matthew's gospel, and in all cases, the depictions of the Gentiles is positive. Okay, the depiction is positive, and they serve as good examples of faith. Even where do we see Gentiles in the gospel of Matthew? Well, the first one is actually the Magi who come. They see the star and they want to come and they want to honor this new baby who's born King of the Jews. And they bring these expensive treasures to him and they bow down before him, using that word that's an act of worship, and give him the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So they are people who recognize who Jesus really is, even though they're not Jewish, right? And they show their respect and their honor for him. Then we have the centurion who has a sick servant and wants Jesus to come and heal the servant. But he says, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. And Jesus praises him. He says, even in all of Israel, I've never found faith like this. And then there's another one. And this is the Canaanite woman, or called Syrophoenician woman by Mark. Matthew calls her the Canaanite woman. This is the woman who, again, she's not Jewish, but she has a daughter who is very sick. The daughter is demon possessed. And she asks Jesus, she's persistent. She's calling after him and he's ignoring her. And the disciples get annoyed. They say, Lord, send her away, stop her but he's really using her as an example of persistence. And finally, he says, what do you want me to do? She says, heal my daughter. He says, it's not right to take the children's food and give it to the dogs. Remember that? And so this is something that's very distressing or very disturbing to those of us who think that Jesus was calling this poor lady a dog. He was not. He was really testing her faith. And then she responds in the most extraordinary manner, yes, Lord. She doesn't say, how dare you say that to me? Instead, she says, yes, that's true. But even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table, right? And so her response is one of such humility that Jesus praises her, and she's Gentile, so she also is praised. And then the last person in the Gospels who is praised, or at least a good example in the Gospels, is the centurion at the foot of the cross, because when he sees all of these things, he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. Okay, so it's very interesting that we have a very, very Jewish gospel that has really no room for the Gentiles, and Jesus is very clear that he's come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. and that the disciples are not to go to any Gentile towns, but just go to the Jewish people, not even to any Samaritan towns. And yet, nonetheless, we have this extraordinary receptiveness to the Gentiles, and even using Gentiles as good examples. They're kind of like a foretaste of what is to come. The fact that the Jewish people, most of them would not accept Jesus, but the Gentiles do. Okay. Well, we're almost out of time, and I'm going to read a little bit from St. John Chrysostom. I had a lot more to read from Chrysostom, but I think we got a really good, solid introduction to Matthew's Gospel, which I hope you will remember. But what I want to, let's see, what are we going to read to you from St. John Chrysostom, homily number 1 in Matthew? One of the things that the way he begins is that Chrysostom begins by saying that really we should not need scriptures. And he says that the reason why we have the scriptures, because Jesus didn't write scriptures. He never really intended us to have scriptures. But because we weren't living the life of the Spirit, we began to sin, and instead we needed scriptures. So things were put into writing, because God did not give anything in writing. Even to people like Noah and Abraham, God communicated directly to these great luminaries of the Old Testament. They didn't need writings, and we shouldn't need writings either. This was his point, but we should instead need only the grace of the Spirit. But because we haven't really been living grace-filled, Spirit-filled lives, we have made shipwreck of our lives, and we stand in need of the written word to help us. And then Chrysostom says, well, if God has given us, by God's great condescension, he has allowed us to have these writings, it's a great evil that we don't even pay attention to these writings. And now we are failing again, even with this second remedy. So he says, consider how heavy the charge will be against us. In other words, consider how heavily we will be judged and condemned if we ignore even these writings, which God has given us for our edification. We treat the writings, he's talking about the Gospels here, of course, all of the Holy Scriptures. He says that we treat them with neglect, as if they have no purpose, and we will bring down punishment upon ourselves because of this. So he says, let us pay close attention to this. And he begins to talk about the Gospel of Matthew. He talks about how law was given in the Old Testament, and that law was given on Mount Sinai with thunder and lightnings, and Moses climbing up the mountain and going into the cloud, and the people were all at the foot of the mountain, frightened to death. And yet when it comes to the New Testament, that's not the way we see the law being given. Okay? Instead, the law is given when God himself comes to earth. And he says these beautiful things. There's nothing greater than this gospel message, the fact that God became a human being. He entered history. So he talks about how God came to earth, therefore man went up to heaven, and the war between us was brought to an end, that there was a reconciliation between us and God. And he says that we have received all of this. All of this was done for us without any labor on our part. And that's an excellent example. Have you ever thought about that? The gift of God, God coming to earth, and then even the writing of the Gospels, these scriptures that we have, all of this is done freely given to us without any kind of labor, without any kind of suffering, without any kind of fatigue, but simply because God loves us, we have received these things. So then he asks the question, why were there 4 evangelists? Wasn't one of them sufficient to tell everything that needed to be told? And he says, yes, but the fact that there are 4 evangelists, they wrote at different times, in different places, and yet in their essentials, they agree on everything. This proves the trustworthiness, the truthfulness of the gospel message. Now, they didn't agree on absolutely everything. There are little differences between them. And this again proves their veracity. They didn't get together, they didn't collude together to get their story straight and say exactly the same thing. Instead, there are some little disagreements in little tiny ways, but it shows again, overall, because they agree on the important things, it shows that these Gospels are trustworthy and true. And they don't disagree on any of the important things. Now, he talks about Matthew and Luke and John. Why did they write? So Luke tells us why he's writing. He's writing to Theophilus. And John, Chrysostom mentions here the fact that there was this, that John had a much more spiritual gospel that really spoke more to the divinity of Christ. But then, what about Matthew? Here's what he says. This is St. John Chrysostom, Homily 1 on the Gospel of Matthew. Of Matthew, again, it is said that when those who are from among the Jews had believed came to him, they besought him to leave to them in writing the same things which he had spoken to them by word. He also composed his gospel in the language of the Hebrews. So you see how Chrysostom is repeating that already very ancient tradition. When Chrysostom is speaking in the 390s, we know that this tradition existed, easily 300 years before, definitely before the end of the first century, that we know this tradition of who wrote which gospel. So he reminds them of this. And Mark too in Egypt is said to have done this self-same thing at the entreaty of his disciples. For this reason, then, Matthew, writing to Hebrews, sought to show nothing more than that the Lord was from Abraham and David. But Luke, as discoursing to all in general, in other words, Luke has a broader audience, not just a Jewish audience, traces up the account higher, going on even to Adam. So his point is that look at how Chrysostom is looking at the reason why each author wrote, who the audience was, and how that affects how he chose to tell the story. And it's reflected in the content of that gospel. So one of the things that we always do in biblical studies is we look at the author and the audience. That's one of the very first things that we do. Okay? So we see that here also. So he also says, I thought this was kind of interesting. Now, where each one was abiding when he wrote, it is not right for us to affirm very positively. You see, we don't know where the evangelists were writing when they wrote these Gospels. And that was still a question at the time of Chrysostom. And so he decides not to talk about it. He says we can't affirm this very positively. There must have been traditions, or there must have been some analysis that they did, came to certain conclusions, but we don't know it for certain. So he chooses not to talk about this. But he says that the evangelists did not speak anything in opposition to each other. Now, I'm going to have to stop here because we have run out of time. But he does say some pretty interesting things comparing Matthew to Greek philosophy, and I think you're going to get a kick out of it. So I'm going to continue with this next week. So from here on until into the foreseeable future, we will be discussing Matthew's gospel. There's a lot to say, and I think you're going to really enjoy it. I hope you're going to benefit a lot from it. So join me every Monday night, okay, right here on Search the Scriptures Live. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.